It's not. At least not all of it. The idea that all adult animation is ugly is not a new one, and it's one that's shared with a lot of people. And with shows like Big Mouth and Family Guy having some uninspired or just unappealing art styles, it's not hard to see why. Art styles of those cartoons being in stark contrast with some of the biggest kids cartoons nowadays like Steven Universe and The Owl House, and you can probably see why people have this sentiment, ignoring all the Cal art style naysayers about The Owl House and Steven Universe. But is it fair for people to put the label of ugly on all adult animation, or is everyone being a bit hyperbolic? Except for Big Mouth. Big Mouth is really ugly. I personally think the evolution for everyone to have chins was a pretty good idea.
I know that underbites are kind of ugly.
Well, not even like underbites. It's just like
character should have
underbites. How did this series get a spin-off? You know they're getting
over like puberty.
They're just getting weird.
Big Mouth
kids.
Cinematic universe.
And it's like we're watching them like do this
MCU.
stuff. Isn't that weird? I don't think I'll be talking about Big Mouth too much in this video, but we'll see. Anyway, just play the intro. For all intents and purposes, I'm only going to be talking about American adult animation and not anything from like Japan or anything, because they have their fair share of good adult animation. To find out where this problem came from in the first place, we have to go back to the very beginning. Most things created during the early ages of entertainment weren't specifically made for anyone, but they were made so that everyone could enjoy it. This meant that more mature things weren't really welcomed with open arms by all audiences. So, depending on who you ask, from the early 1920s to the late 60s, the Hays Code was enforced. This code was a set of rules that you had to follow in order to get your film released into the public, so more mature things, animated or not, were not allowed. Things like drugs, violence, and sex were all off the table. The movies that really thrived were Disney films and silent films, as those were usually lighthearted and appealing for children. There wasn't anything being made for adults at all because it wasn't allowed to be made. This changed in the late 60s when the Hays Code was replaced with the rating system that we know today. The Hays Code getting replaced, we were able to see foreign films that were a bit more adult on the animated side. So we were finally able to see some of the first animated adult cartoons that weren't just porn. My personal favorite from the bunch is Bambi Meets Godzilla. These few foreign films were one of the first remnants of adult animation that we had in America. From 1968 to 1989, there weren't really too many strictly adult cartoons that were streaming on TV. You had Hanna-Barbera cartoons like the Flintstones and Wait Till Your Father Gets Home, but those weren't really made specifically for adults. The only thing that really made those adult cartoons is they were sitcoms but animated. Wait Till Your Father Gets Home in particular kind of felt like early remnants of Family Guy. Wait Till Your Father Gets Home is about a dysfunctional American family following the character of Harry, the guy of the family. The Family Guy, perhaps. The show mainly focusing on Harry showed that the show wasn't really targeted towards kids, because there wasn't anything for kids to really grasp onto. I don't really know if any kids were really jumping at the opportunity to watch a middle-aged balding man go through the turmoils of middle-aged balding. And unlike the Flintstones, there wasn't any fun dinosaur or prehistoric setting for kids to grasp onto at all. It was just a sitcom.
You're going with Bob?
Well, not just him. Another couple, Ted and Carol.
Ted and Carol and Bob and...
Right.
Wrong.
It's very similar to Family Guy. Even the way that Harry's wife says Harry is kind of similar to how Peter's wife says Peter.
As you can see, we ain't exactly the King family.
Harry. I'm early tonight, Harry.
For this, I put on my mohair?
Harry.
Maybe you could join Peter.
The entire Hanna-Barbera cartoon catalog didn't really have a different art style throughout its shows. It was all kind of just one art style. Was the art style ugly? Not really, but it wasn't really pretty either. The art style and comedy of these cartoons kind of seemed like comic strips just stretched out into 20 minutes, which is why they looked and were animated the way that they were. The same could sort of be said about The Simpsons at the time. These shows were the most mature shows that you were able to get at the time. The highest rating that these shows got was TVG. In the future, The Simpsons would get TV-14, but that was in the future. There wasn't anything really too interesting to do in these avenues yet, so because these shows are old, it's understandable why they look this way. Even though The Simpsons still looks this way and it's like still holding on by its pinky toes. You guys should just put this dead horse down already. It's all crippled and ugly and all the kids are scared to ride it. After all these cartoons, everything was about to change in America, because in other countries they already had adult animation that looked pretty dang good. But everything changed with 90s MTV.
The 1994 MTV Video Music Awards opening act is brought to you by Pepsi, who reminds you to be young.
MTV, now being a husk of its former self, was the one-stop shop for all popular music. And popular music at the time, for lack of a better word, was pretty edgy. The programming at the time was targeted at younger audiences, but not children, mostly young adults and teenagers. And with a more mature audience meant more mature shows. In 1991, Aeon Flux released on the animated anthology show Liquid Television. The pilot of Aeon Flux was aired on Liquid Television, which was an anthology series similar to Robot Chicken and maybe like Cartoon Network's Mad or something. Although Aeon Flux aired on Liquid Television, the reason I'm talking about only Aeon Flux is because it was the first animated thing to try and tell a story that was a bit more mature with the medium of animation. After airing on Liquid Television, it would get its own series in 1995, spanning 10 episodes across 2 seasons. Aeon Flux is such an interesting departure from adult animation because even compared to modern adult animation, it's very strange. It's a very artistic sci-fi show where Aeon is kind of just like doing stuff, very cool stuff, but like also very sexy stuff. She's very sexy.
The idea was to present a lot of action which was offered without any explanation. The film actually begins right in the middle, or actually towards the end of her mission. And so you're in a position of having to figure out what's happening as it happens, and also try to figure out what happened before the film had begun.
The shorts at the time were meant to be hard to follow and very strange, which is such a strange departure from even modern adult animation, at least in the West anyway, because while Japan gets Akira and Evangelion, we don't. But this is one of the first adult animated shows to come out, so maybe this is where adult animation was going. Alongside Japan, we'll get more shows just like Aeon Flux that were cool and interesting. The show on paper was very appealing to modern audiences, but in practice, it kind of wasn't. It did have critical acclaim, but it didn't have the mass appeal that MTV's next venture would. The creator of the show, Peter Chung, had a vision for what he wanted to create. Peter was a genuine artist, and he didn't want to be held back by people telling him what he had to do and how he had to do it. Something interesting about Peter is he used to work on Rugrats. Going from animating Chucky to animating Aeon is a pretty big leap if you ask me. He created Aeon Flux because he was tired of how limiting working on Rugrats was. Liquid Television was his way of being able to do so. Liquid Television, which I mentioned earlier, was a great way for animators at the time to get their work out there, because Liquid Television definitely wasn't a kids show.
Jump, jump, jump.
Liquid Television was so strange looking back. There were a lot of variety shows like SNL and the Benny Hill show and the Muppets. What's interesting about Liquid Television is its main focus was animation. The category it was in was literally just animation, kind of similar to how the Muppets' main focus is the Muppets. And some might think it being one of the first animated clip shows, it would be made for kids, and they'd be wrong. The show gave way for independent animators and creators to get their stuff out there because this was the only way to do so. Two very notable animators that came from Liquid Television were obviously Peter Chung and Mike Judge, creator of Beavis and Butthead. The first appearance of Beavis and Butthead was in the Liquid Television short Beavis and Butthead Frog Baseball.
Frog Baseball!
Releasing in 1992 to mass audience appeal, Beavis and Butthead was one of the first cartoons to make it big that was made for adults. Creator Mike Judge went into the creation of Beavis and Butthead with the idea of why is all animation seen as made for kids?
Yeah, animation, like, you know, I was, because I came not too long after The Simpsons had started, but people just had it in their head that a cartoon is for kids. But yeah, it was right around that time, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, was this thing happening of just, you know, cartoons, animation. The idea that there was a cartoon that with good stories and funny and great characters and relevant was just, you know, kind of mind-boggling.
Judge's art style on the show definitely differentiated itself from other cartoons at the time, and whether this was to differentiate itself or it was just because this was Judge's art style, it definitely stood out, and it was kind of ugly, honestly. But despite it being ugly, it was a commercial and critical success, because even though the show was ugly, Mike Judge wasn't trying to make another Aeon Flux. He just wanted to make something that he thought was funny. He probably didn't think that the show would be as successful as it was, but people loved it, and this seemed to be the direction that adult animation would start to go in. Towards the end of the 90s, there were many more adult cartoons that would be released that were pretty important. The more notable ones being Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Duckman, King of the Hill, Dana, South Park, Family Guy, Futurama, Home Videos, and some that I just don't want to mention because I don't care. Something that people could say about all these shows is that they look like adult animation, except for maybe Duckman and South Park. For Duckman, I think it was kind of on purpose. It was kind of made that way because it was like, oh look, talking duck, but he says fuck or something. I don't know, I didn't watch the show. But something that's interesting about all these shows is that all of their art styles are very distinct. Space Ghost Coast to Coast was very interesting as it combined the mediums of live action and animation to make a very interesting talk show. And South Park could probably be confused for kid shows. Maybe that's just because the main characters are kids or who knows what, but I honestly think that the art style is pretty cute. This is a far departure from what we see in modern animation, where every show either looks like Family Guy or Rick and Morty, or a made-up show I made called The Family Guy Rick and His Grandson Mortimer. In the late 90s, adult animation seemed to get its kick into the mainstream. With Beavis and Butthead being a huge success, other networks tried to ride off that, with Comedy Central picking up South Park, and Fox picking up Family Guy. The late 90s really seemed to be the birth of adult animation. Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Family Guy, and South Park were all very important to what modern adult animation is, all for separate reasons. For the sake of understanding, I'm gonna go into all of them separately.
See, you have your accordion. I command you to play it.
Space Ghost!
Space Ghost Coast to Coast premiered on Cartoon Network, which mainly showed Hanna-Barbera cartoons at the time, which explains why the main character, Space Ghost, was based on a Hanna-Barbera character. Earlier episodes of Space Ghost was rated PG, as the humor wasn't too mature for a child to understand, but I personally think it was definitely too weird for a kid to understand. Other shows at the time were a bit louder, a bit more obvious with their jokes, when sometimes the silence was the joke for Space Ghost. This made Space Ghost a bit of an outlier in all these shows. Other cartoons at the time had things that kids could relate to or grasp onto, and Space Ghost had Space Ghost, who was a late night talk show host / Hanna-Barbera cartoon, and whose sidekick for the show was an evil praying mantis. Because if there's anything that kids like, it's David Letterman and wisecracking space bugs. What's strange about Space Ghost is the animation was not the appeal, but the humor, and the show is really funny. To adults. This seemed weird because a lot of the cartoons playing on Cartoon Network were children oriented. This didn't really matter though because Cartoon Network had a large amount of viewership from adults already. The cartoons at the time were mostly made for children. The problem with that is that kids would go to bed at some point, which means there's no one to advertise to. No one to advertise to means no one buying ad blocks. Knowing that they had a sizable adult audience meant that the venture for late night programming specifically made for adults was pretty appealing. It gave reason reason for audiences to stick around, and it gave reason for advertisers to also stick around. Thus, Adult Swim was born. Adult Swim to this day has a very iconic aesthetic, and at the time, the reason for this aesthetic was budget. This reasoning could also be seen in Adult Swim's early programming. A lot of early programming of Adult Swim cartoons was just different takes on Hanna-Barbera cartoons that already existed. Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Harvey Birdman Attorney at Law, and SeaLab 2021 all just essentially reused assets from those shows to make their own shows. All of these shows' art style seemed a bit formulaic, and adding Aqua Teen Hunger Force into the mix, it kind of showed that the focus of these shows wasn't really the animation. Similar to Beavis and Butthead, the main focus of these shows was the humor, which is why the animation would be a bit choppy, or sometimes even bad. All the early Adult Swim shows, except for Aqua Teen Hunger Force, were essentially fan dubs. They would just take early assets from other shows and make their own show out of it.
Yeah, that looks like a squid to me.
Really? I don't see it.
It's the squid-shaped thing.
Oh, yeah, with the tentacles.
Sí, Capitán.
Nope, don't see it.
Space Ghost Coast to Coast and SeaLab 2021 literally took like the show, not just art from the show. They took the show and made their own show out of it. Harvey Birdman took characters from Hanna-Barbera cartoons and made them their own by parodying them. I also do want to say that SeaLab 2021 has one of the best theme songs I've ever heard.
Yo, yo, yo! Ah!
So for budgetary reasons, this is what adult animation was at the time. Space Ghost Coast to Coast was important to the future of modern adult animation because it sort of gave birth to Adult Swim. The next important show is South Park. For the next part of the video, I'm going to be focusing on a different part of South Park. I'm going to be talking about the substance. South Park is one of the most crude, vile, and funny things that you can watch today. South Park is notorious for how controversial it can get.
September 11th happened. Our fans would expect us to do something. And we're the one show that was not going to turn and run and hide from this issue. We were supposed to be the fearless show.
The appeal of the show to a lot of people is how far it goes sometimes. It being a cartoon allows the show to go into many different directions that live action simply wouldn't let you. When I was younger, I wanted to watch South Park because I thought it was a cartoon for kids. And I wanted to watch it because I was a kid. But I remember not being allowed to do so, and looking back, I'm glad that was the case. No kid should be watching South Park, obviously. The way that South Park looks the way it does is because the short that South Park came from was made from construction paper, and they kind of just took the art style from that and just moved it on to South Park. South Park falls into a category akin to Happy Tree Friends, where the art style is a bit misleading, making you think that it might be a kid's show. But does the misleading come from the fact that adult animation looks more mature than kids animation, or from the fact that all adult animation looks the same? Well, obviously not all adult animation looks the same, and I think the only thing that makes people think that an art style is mature is because the main characters of the show are adults. Whatever art style a show is created in, it's usually just because. There's not really a reason. With early adult animation, they look the way they did just because that's what the creator of the show wanted. But something that you could say about all these shows is that they really push the envelope in what could be done in adult animation, or animation in general. At the time, animation was seen as mostly for kids, and South Park looking the way it does and having the humor that it does definitely changed that sentiment. The way that these shows look are all very unique and inspired. I don't really think the same could be said for Family Guy though. Family Guy at the time was a very novel concept.
It's the most enticing new series of the season.
I must prepare for my journey. Missing grenades, mace, Aggie full of Cheerios.
Outrageously funny.
One of the biggest selling points with Family Guy at the time was that things that don't talk did talk. Whoa, look, a baby's talking, and a dog is talking, and oh, they said a bad word. That's pretty funny. At the time, the idea of Stewie and Brian were kind of novel, but that's just because it wasn't done in adult animation yet. We've already seen talking babies and talking dogs and other things, but since it was in adult animation, you could make them say some really crazy stuff. You can make them swear even. Yeah. No, yeah. You really do that. Even at the time, Family Guy just kind of seemed like The Simpsons, but for an older audience. Family Guy came from another creation of Seth MacFarlane called Larry and Bird. Similar to the characters in Family Guy, Larry and Bird has the characters of a middle-class New England man, a one-dimensional wife, and a talking dog. The show was released in 1996, and in my opinion was very reminiscent of other like comic strip cartoons at the time. But the time of comic strip cartoons kind of passed. Cartoons were kind of just like a normal thing now. You didn't really have to constrict yourself with the mediums of comic strip cartoons. That's what I'm calling them now. While other cartoons created at the time really pushed the envelope and did unique things in the medium of animation, Family Guy had a talking baby. You may be thinking I don't like Family Guy, and you're right, but it's not the substance of the show that I don't like. Some of Family Guy is kind of funny.
Put the dog out. The dog's crying. Can someone put the dog out?
What I don't like about Family Guy is what it's done to modern animation. Even though the art style right now looks very formulaic, at the time it didn't really matter because the only other thing that you could really compare Family Guy to was The Simpsons. So during this time with adult animation already going in so many different directions with how people were using the medium of animation to make adult content, Family Guy wasn't. This really made Family Guy an outlier with all of these shows that were coming out. It was just another animated sitcom. But despite Family Guy being a step in no direction and to some even being a step back, Family Guy was a huge hit. Perhaps not straying from the old made people comfortable with Family Guy. You don't want to get too crazy now, can't stray too far from what we know. This is something that we'll see in the coming future. From all the examples that I've looked at, adult animation looks pretty good in the realms of visual appeal. The only one that's not really that exciting was Family Guy. So right now I'm actually going to be comparing and contrasting art styles from adult cartoons and children's cartoons at the time. So a year into Adult Swim's life, were the cartoons that were made for children better looking than the ones that were made for adults? No. There were some really ugly shows in the 90s and early aughts. Again, I think the only thing that made adult cartoons more mature was just that sometimes the main characters were adults. But something that you could also see in children's cartoons was people getting a bit more creative with what they did with the medium of animation. Courage the Cowardly Dog, for example, was a cool horror show that was scary for kids. Not me though. Invader Zim was based on a comic about a serial killer, which is just a weird thing to make a kid's cartoon around. Both kids and adult cartoons are making big strides into making animation very unique. Some other early adult cartoons that were made at the time that I think were very unique were Drawn Together, Happy Tree Friends, Robot Chicken, 12-Ounce Mouse, combining animation styles, stop motion, animation that looks like it was made for kids, pencil animation. During this time, there were so many things being done in animation, adult or otherwise, that made everything so fresh and unique. But there was something sinister happening in the background. Something that would change the landscape of adult animation forever. While we see all these new adult animated shows doing unique things with their art styles, we see something lurking in the background. Add like a lightning sound effect or something. One thing that didn't try at all to stray far from what people were doing. This thing's name was Seth MacFarlane. Fuck no, not Seth MacFarlane. Seth MacFarlane, in my opinion, is a big factor to why adult animation gets the reputation that it does, at least in its art style. The aforementioned Family Guy was a huge hit and still is, and Seth MacFarlane will get 2 more shows after that. The Cleveland Show was literally a Family Guy spin-off. The only difference between the two was that it focused on Cleveland Brown and not Peter Griffin. American Dad was actually supposed to replace Family Guy. Family Guy wasn't supposed to get another season, so maybe American Dad would be different from Family Guy. A lot of people say that anyway, and they're wrong. Despite what people may say, American Dad is literally just Family Guy. I don't care. Sure, the shows are different when it comes down to substance, but when it comes to originality, there isn't much of that. All 3 of these shows take place in American households where the main characters are kind of dicks, and they have teenagers or kids, and they have kids that shouldn't talk but they do talk, and they have other things that don't talk but they do talk, and they are human and whatever, blah blah blah. They're all the same. These shows tend to stick to the outdated format of an American sitcom, but just making it animated. These shows have lived for such a long time. American Dad and Family Guy are some of the biggest cartoons in American adult animation right now. It having the same animation style and it being created by the same dude doesn't bode well for people thinking that all American adult animation looks the exact same. There was a lot of original adult animation in the early 2000s that were really cool and really fresh. Maybe in the next decade, there will be even more of that. Maybe the next decade will be just as good, if not better than the last. Who knows? It did get better. But I'm going to be talking about the bad parts first, because why would people have this sentiment if it wasn't kind of true, right? From 2010 to now, we got shows like Bob's Burgers, Paradise PD, Big Mouth, Rick and Morty, F is for Family, BoJack Horseman, Final Space, Close Enough, and more. For all of the shows that I listed, you could probably say that the art style looks kind of formulaic or ugly, and I would honestly agree, with all the examples that I gave anyway. I know that ugly is a bit subjective, but I think that one thing that could be said about all these shows that I listed was they all look like adult animation, which is odd because there is no adult animation art style. They all look different, but they all look like adult animation. All of them either look hyper realistic, or they have really round eyeballs, or maybe their proportions are just weird for the sake of like looking weird. I don't know. A question I asked about a lot of the shows earlier was, why is this show animated in the way that it is? The answer to that question would usually be, that was the vision of the creator. Sometimes it would look super cool and creative, and other times it would look pretty ugly. But something about all those shows earlier was that they had a lot of personality. Nowadays, I feel like the answer to that question has changed. With the success of earlier shows essentially just being animated sitcoms with nothing interesting about their art styles or stories, other shows would follow. A lot of shows that come out get the criticism that they do because they look like another already established adult animated cartoon. Whether it be Family Guy or The Simpsons or Family Guy, it looks like everyone's just trying to ride out the success that Seth MacFarlane had. Making a lazy animated sitcom work for Seth MacFarlane, so why not do it exactly like he did? This looks like this and that looks like that, and all the cartoons look like something that already exists and worked before. So let's try to do the same thing that we did with cartoons from the late 90s and early 2000s with modern children's cartoons. And in all honesty, if you really try, you can make these art styles work for children's cartoons too. I think the only difference is that now a lot of adult cartoons look the same as other adult cartoons, making the illusion that there is an adult animated art style. This is where the central idea that all adult animation is ugly sort of comes from. But the cartoons that get these criticisms are usually on networks or made by people who don't really seem to care, except for maybe BoJack Horseman and Rick and Morty, which we'll get into later. The homes of these shows aren't for people that are looking for things that will do anything super interesting. They're just kind of looking for something that'll make them laugh. At the end of the day, that's the goal of pretty much all of these shows. Big Mouth, Bob's Burgers, Family Guy, all of these shows are just trying to make you laugh. The reason that they look the way they do is just because it works, I guess. They don't have to do anything too different, and a lot of shows just don't. People still do the bare minimum, at least in art style. But even though there is such an oversaturation of cartoons that simply focus on comedy, leaving the art style in the dust, there are so many cartoons that are just not ugly. How can I word that better? Cartoons that are just awesome. I said earlier that it did get better. You forget already? You silly goose. I was very specific in the shows I exemplified because there are a lot of really good adult animated cartoons. There is an obvious oversaturation of shows that are not lit and kind of suck. You know, we already talked about the earlier days of Adult Swim, but I didn't talk about Boondocks or Moral Laurel or Venture Bros. Even in modern days, we got some really good stuff coming from Adult Swim. Mike Tyson Mysteries is such a stupid concept, but it works so well as a more mature, but I think even stupider Scooby-Doo parody. Samurai Jack, although originally made for kids, was brought back to life by Adult Swim, which is pretty cool. Smiling Friends. There's also this show called Primal that no one really talks about, and I think is a shame. The general synopsis of the show is that there's a caveman who teams up with a dinosaur. I guess you could call it a buddy claw show. a buddy dinosaur show, Good Cop Bad Dinosaur, NCIS, but the S stands for Stegosaurus. This show, in my opinion, is what adult animation should strive to be. Have an art style that's appealing to everyone, while the show is also hard-hitting, gritty, and dark. The show looks rugged, but the animation is also very silky smooth. There's also no words in the show, which I think is pretty cool. Just a man and his dinosaur. And what more could you ask for? Get past the first 2 episodes and you'll have one of the best, most stylized cartoons I've ever seen. Adult Swim also helped bring anime into the mainstream. From its start, it was already showing shows like Cowboy Bebop and Dragon Ball Z, but even to this day, they're showing shows like Kill la Kill and Dr. Stone. And with more things coming from Adult Swim in the future, it doesn't seem like their contribution to adult animation will stop anytime soon. But enough with Adult Swim, you big, beautiful, respectful to adult animation network, you. Let's talk about some other banger adult cartoons. Amazon has been coming with a lot of edgier adult cartoons. Boys Diabolical is diabolical. The Boys spin-off looked like that other show that they came out with, Vox Machina. I actually haven't seen The Boys Diabolical, but I have seen Vox Machina, which is pretty good. The show kind of makes me want to play D&D, except every time I go to create a character, I forget how many character types there are, and I get overwhelmed, and I just stop. Oh, I guess there's also... Invincible in recent times has gained a lot of popularity, which I think is a really good thing for adult animation. I remember watching it every week and thinking, oh yeah, most cartoons aren't like this, huh? One of the things that makes the show work so well is the art style. If the show didn't look like The Amazing Spider-Man or the Justice League, it wouldn't work nearly as well as it does. And Lord knows, if it was picked up by a different network, it would probably look like Family Guy. Hulu also has some interesting adult animated shows. They have Hitmonkey, which seemed like Hulu's answer to... Is it gonna do that every time? Hitmonkey was a pretty good nice step in adult animation. Very, very violent. They also have Crossing Swords, which is like really cute. Like really cute. I don't know why it's animated like that. It's just really cute. I think Rooster Teeth is also worth a mention. Bravest Warriors, while not being an adult cartoon, I'm counting because they do say crud. They also made Ruby, which I haven't seen but looks pretty good. But for my money, Camp Camp is the show that should be recognized when it comes to adult animated art styles.
Camp Campbell is the place for me and you. We'll swim through lakes and climb up trees, catch fish, bugs, bears, and honeybees. There's endless...
This show gets pretty crass and gross, but I think it looks better than something like Kick Buttowski. Another thing about the show is that most of the main characters are kids, lending itself to that South Park sort of area, where it sort of blurs the line between adult animation and kids animation. But now, let's talk about Netflix. Netflix is a beast of its own simply because of how much stuff it's got. When you have as many adult animated shows as Netflix, you're bound to have some bad ones. And while yes, I'm not going to deny that Netflix does have Paradise PD and Big Mouth and Hoops and that one show about the auntie and the one about the British people. The point of this video is to disprove the idea that all adult animation is ugly. Because even though Netflix is a big perpetrator of this ugly Family Guy art style, it's also a big perpetrator of awesome. Midnight Gospel, while getting a good amount of recognition, doesn't get the praise that I think it deserves. The idea of the show alone was really cool, and the idea also allowed there to be a lot of creativity in the animation. That creativity really showed. Love, Death, and Robots is an anthology animated series, which means that every episode is different from the last, meaning that there's a lot of different art styles that could be contributed to this. Sometimes you have some very simple art styles, sometimes you have some very colorful art styles, and sometimes you have Eric Foreman from that 70s show. One criticism that I will give to Love, Death, and Robots is that sometimes the more realistic shorts kind of just look like video game cutscenes, and I think there should be less of those, even though some of them are pretty cool. Also, if you think Jabbaro's pretentious, you're kind of stupid.
Oh, the misery Every single person is my enemy.
Arcane is great, but I hate it because it's making people want to play League of Legends. People know Arcane is good, but I'm gonna talk about it too because it has some of the slickest and coolest animation I've seen in a while. A great blend of 2D animation and cel-shaded 3D animation makes this for a really good visual experience and a really good step in adult animation. And it looks nothing like Family Guy. Netflix also gave light to more adult-oriented anime like Beastars and Gretzko, which I will ignore the fact that those are both furry bait. This video is solely supposed to be about art style, but I'd be remiss to not talk about how good some of the more adult art style looking animations can be. Final Space has gone under the radar as far as I know, and while the show looks very adult animated, it has a lot more heart. Rick and Morty's good, but you probably wouldn't get it. Bob's Burgers, while their characters look like they're from Whoville, a lot of the animation is actually surprisingly smooth. And one of the best animated shows I've ever seen, BoJack Horseman, looks awful, I'm not even gonna lie. But despite that, despite the characters having so much flaws, despite most of them being anthropomorphic animals, it's one of the most human shows I've ever seen. So, like I said at the very beginning, for the most part, adult animation isn't ugly. There is a large amount of shows that don't have the adult animation art style. The adult animation art style obviously being the Rick and Morty / Family Guy art style. When it comes to adult animation, the only reason that there seems to be an adult animation style is because there are so many shows with uninspired art styles. But there are so many shows that don't. From the very beginning, there were so many shows that push the envelope in what could and should be done in adult animation. Since people were allowed to create animation, they made things that allowed adults to enjoy animation just as much as kids could, not by differentiating the art style, but the substance of the art. As the years went on, we saw a trend of lazy animation, which allowed ventures of copycats to follow. But we also see creative people still creating really great things. Even the art styles that don't have visual appeal and aren't super sexy can still have really good animation and incredible stories. So, why is all adult animation so ugly? It's not. A lot of people just don't care to make it pretty. Thank you for watching my video. If you like my video, then give the video a like. If you don't like the video, then I'm very surprised you made it this far. And if you like me, then you can subscribe.